Good morning and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Yousef Munayyer. I'm the head of the Palestine-Israel program here at the Arab Center. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar panel entitled Israel's Global Isolation, International Decisions in the Wake of the Gaza War. Israel's brutal war on Gaza, now in its ninth month, has shocked the conscience of much of the world. During this time, several international decisions have been made against the Israeli government, contributing to its international isolation, including at the International Court of Justice, which is hearing a genocide case brought by the nation of South Africa, which has been joined by many other countries, as well as by the International Criminal Court, whose prosecutor has applied for arrest warrants for Israeli leaders, including the Israeli Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, and also decisions by European states, which have recognized a Palestinian state for the first time. Last month, Norway, Ireland, and Spain on the same day announced their recognition of Palestine, and it came in the same week as the ICC's announcement of an application for arrest warrants, as well as decisions by the International Court of Justice, highlighting just how much Israel's war on Gaza has hurt its international standing. We've convened this panel of experts to discuss the impact of these decisions in the long and short term. What do they foreshadow about the future? And how have Israel and its allies responded to them? How have Palestinians and others responded? How might we see international decisions evolve from here? How can international actors with limited leverage over Israel best contribute to peace, justice, and accountability? We're very fortunate to have this panel to talk through these questions and more today. For today's conversation, we'll begin with about 10 to 12 minutes of remarks from each panelist, followed by moderators' questions, and then a question and answer session with you and our audience. Please note that you don't need to wait until the Q&A portion to submit your questions for this morning's speakers. You can send in your questions at any time using the Q&A feature in Zoom or via email to events@arabcenterdc.org. Now, in the interest of time, I want to move directly to briefly introducing our guests now in the order that they will be presenting their introductory remarks and then beginning our discussion. Susan Akram is a professor at Boston University School of Law. Ahmed Abofoul is international lawyer and senior legal research and advocacy officer at Al-Haq, a human rights organization based in Palestine. And Tahani Mustafa is senior Palestine analyst, the International Crisis Group. Daniel Levy, who is scheduled to join us, unfortunately cannot be with us this morning due to unforeseen circumstances, but we look forward to having him at another time. We welcome all of you. Thank you for being with us today. Susan, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Yousef, and the Arab Center. It's always a pleasure to share the conversation with you. And I think the first order of business is to briefly set out the legal framework under which the international courts have been engaged on the question of genocide and related international crimes. Genocide is, of course, among the gravest of international crimes that include crimes against humanity, aggression, and war crimes. Genocide is defined in the 1948 Genocide Convention, which has been ratified by 153 states, as well as in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which has been ratified by 124 states. The definition of genocide is the same in both treaties. It is the intentional destruction, in whole or in part, of any national, ethnic, religious, or racial group through specific acts. And these acts are killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting conditions of life designed to bring about the group's physical destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent births, or forcibly transferring children of this group to another group. Now, there are two important points to make about genocide as a universal crime in order to understand the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court cases. First, it's what's called a jus cogens prohibition, meaning that no state can derogate from it or suspend its application for any reason. Second, genocide triggers erga omnes obligations, meaning that it places obligations on all states parties to act and to prevent and punish genocide crimes. So based on these obligations under the Genocide Convention, South Africa filed a case on December 29th of last year in the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, claiming that Israel's prosecution of its war on Gaza after October 7th amounted to genocide. After extensive pleadings and oral arguments, the ICJ issued provisional measures, first on January 23rd of this year on South Africa's claim. Now, provisional measures, for those who aren't familiar, are akin to preliminary injunctions in domestic courts. They're issued on the basis of prima facie or preliminary findings before a full hearing on the merits of a claim. In its January 26 precautionary measures, the ICJ found that it was plausible that Israel is committing genocidal acts and that elements of the Genocide Convention have been met. It ordered Israel to stop its military from killing, causing serious bodily or mental harm, and deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction of Palestinians in Gaza. It also ordered Israel to stop direct and public incitement to genocide and urgently allow all basic services and humanitarian assistance to be delivered to Gazans. On March 28th, after South Africa returned again to the court with additional evidence, the ICJ reiterated its prior precautionary measures, giving more specificity to its orders to immediately and unconditionally open all border crossings and allow unlimited humanitarian aid to Gaza, including food, water, fuel, medical, and other necessities. And then again, for a third time, on May 24th, the court ordered Israel to immediately halt its military offensive in Rafah, open the Rafah crossing for unimpeded aid, and allow access to Gaza of an investigative body to determine evidence of genocide. Now, in a separate case, Nicaragua instituted proceedings against Germany at the ICJ in March for Germany's support for Israel, claiming that Germany is facilitating the commission of genocide by providing arms to Israel in violation of the Genocide Convention. The ICJ declined to issue provisional measures in that case, but it did not throw out Nicaragua's case as Germany had requested. So that case is also ongoing. Meanwhile, on May 20th, the ICC, the criminal court special prosecutor, Karim Khan, announced that he had requested arrest warrants for 3 Hamas principals and for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Minister of Defense Gallant. The charges against Hamas's Mohammed Deif, Ismail Haniyeh, and Yahya Sinwar include murder, hostage-taking, sexual violence, and torture as either war crimes or crimes against humanity, while the charges against Netanyahu and Gallant are on starvation, willful killing, targeting of civilians, extermination, and murder as war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, it's important to note that genocide is not among the crimes against Netanyahu and Gallant, at least so far, though it's important to note that the evidence of many of these charges as war crimes or crimes against humanity will also prove elements of genocide. Conversely, much of the evidence developed in the ICJ cases will also support the ICC charges. There are many unresolved issues in the requests for warrants as far as the charges have been made public, which will have to be addressed as Khan presents his evidence to the pretrial chamber. However, these warrant requests have come after years of the ICC prosecutors sitting on claims by Palestine of war crimes since 2019. In June, in a separate event, the UN's Independent Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Territories issued its latest report, finding that Israel is responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza, and that Palestinian armed groups are responsible for war crimes committed in Israel. The Commission also called on Israel to immediately stop its military operations and attacks in Gaza, including the assault on Rafah. Finally, there's also a request for an advisory opinion pending at the ICJ that was submitted on January 9th of last year by the General Assembly on the legality of Israel's ongoing occupation of the occupied territories and its actions against Palestinians, including the denial of self-determination. The ICJ is likely to issue its advisory opinion on this request fairly soon, perhaps this summer, while the outcome of the two contentious cases is unlikely for several years. Both contentious cases and the advisory opinion, depending on the final decisions, but even now, with the precautionary measures, have far-reaching consequences. A finding of genocide or the possibility that genocide is occurring triggers, as I said, obligations on all other states to take steps to stop it and ensure non-complicity. The genocide report that my clinic and other human rights clinics have published ends with a review of what this means to the world community of states. Stop all aid and assistance to Israel's military operations, refrain from dealings with Israel that imply its actions are legal, and punish Israeli principals who are ordering or engaging in genocidal acts. So I'll end with just saying there's no doubt that the ICJ and the ICC cases are a major development in the efforts to end Israel's impunity for decades-long crimes against the Palestinians, and that there is a chance now that international law can deliver some measure of justice, despite the impasse from the political bodies of the UN, the Security Council, and the General Assembly.
Thank you, Susan. Before we move on to Ahmed, I do want to just ask you sort of a follow-up question, if you can elaborate on it a little bit. Obviously, we know there are consequences if decisions are finally issued in some of these contentious cases. That can take a very long time. We don't know how long it will take, but it can take a long time. I don't think there's any expectation that anything is imminent. But what are sort of the legal obligations of other states, and what can and should they do now before those final decisions are issued? What obligations do they have, and what's happening, what's not happening, and what should be happening?
Yes, well, the first obligation is to cease all arms and weapons related supplies to Israel. That's very clear, and that's clear from the provisional measures. It's also clear from the fact that the ICJ has continued the Nicaragua versus Germany case, that it hasn't dismissed it, that there's a claim there, and that is precisely on the issue of complicity by supplying arms. Now, individual states have already begun taking measures, and civil society, particularly legal groups, have filed lawsuits, and Ahmed can say more about the one in the Netherlands, to challenge their own states' sending of arms and weapons-related supplies. So I think those cases are going to multiply. I believe earlier this week, South Korea issued warrants against Israeli principals. So that is a second form of action to build on the provisional measures of finding of genocidal acts, to have domestic courts begin to issue warrants and to take up claims against war criminals. The other most important, perhaps at this stage, measure is ceasing diplomatic relations with Israel, and a number of states have already done that. And then the final really important step is the institution of a sanctions regime. Now, individual states have actually taken some steps on sanctions against particular, for example, settler groups. But in terms of the kind of sanctions regime that we saw against the apartheid regime in South Africa, that remains to be done. But I know yesterday or the day before, South Africa actually announced that it was going to have a global conference in May about how to trigger a global sanctions regime to build on the work that was done against apartheid South Africa.
And just one more follow-up from my end. So, obviously, the ICJ and the ICC, different countries have different relations with those different groups. Some countries have accepted the Rome Statute and recognize the role of the ICC, and others obviously don't, like the United States, for example. But the ICJ is different in that regard. Are we seeing some sort of a different response from the countries based on sort of those relationships? Are we seeing sort of more adherence to the ICJ's decisions than the ICC's? This week we saw the Israeli defense minister, who we obviously saw an application for an arrest warrant for him from the ICC, welcomed here with great fanfare in Washington, D.C. Do we see different behavior from states in this regard based on their relationship with these different international entities?
Yes, I mean, of course, there seem to now the world is divided into two camps, and that is the Israeli supportive camp, which is a smaller and smaller group of states, but they are the powerful states and the ones that hold the veto power at the Security Council. The US seems to have unwavering support for Israel, as does Germany. But I think in Europe, the support for Israel is crumbling as more and more states are recognizing Palestine and distancing themselves from the both diplomatic and weapons support for Israel. The vast majority of the populations and the members of the General Assembly are, of course, have voted again and again for ceasefire and for an end to aid in Israel. So without a doubt, there are these two camps, and that creates this impasse that we have in the political bodies at the United Nations. Now, having said that, as I said, individual countries can take their own steps to issue warrants to target both principals and individuals who they have evidence are committing war crimes, genocidal acts. And as I began our discussion, what's really important is that the vast majority of the countries of the world are states parties to the Genocide Convention. So whatever the International Court of Justice says about third state responsibility is going to be binding on all those states.
Thank you very much, Susan. We will now turn to Ahmed Abofoul from Al-Haq, who joins us from the Hague in the Netherlands. Ahmed, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yousef, and thanks for the Arab Center in DC for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you today and with the distinguished speakers. It's also a pleasure to speak on behalf of Al-Haq, the oldest Palestinian human rights organization in the region. Perhaps I would start a bit with some introduction about Al-Haq's work and explaining Al-Haq mandate. Al-Haq is an independent Palestinian non-governmental human rights organization based in Ramallah in the West Bank, and it was established in 1979, and it's mandated to protect and promote the human rights and the rule of law in the occupied Palestinian territory. So we conduct legal research, draft legal reports, studies, provide interventions, and document, of course, human rights and international humanitarian law violations in the occupied Palestinian territory. We also undertake advocacy before local, regional, and international bodies. This includes, of course, communications to the ICC, position papers on the ICJ were relevant in different proceedings, submissions to the UN different organs, including to the Human Rights Council mechanisms, of course, including the special rapporteurs and the special procedure of the Human Rights Council and the Commission of Inquiry on the Situation in Palestine. So in doing so, we document violations of individuals, of the individual and collective rights of the Palestinian people, irrespective of the identity of the perpetrator. And we seek to end such breaches and provide accountability for such crimes before national and international mechanisms, and aim to hold these perpetrators accountable. So therefore, we also engage in strategic litigation cases in different domestic legal systems, including on accountability for international crimes, business and human rights, and corporate responsibility. Just to explain Al-Haq's vision on how we approach international law. In addition to our engagement with international institutions, we believe that of the necessity of having, so to say, a bottom-up approach in international law. We've always believed of people-led legal work where it's victims and survivors centered. Their perspectives are being amplified. And I think the need for such an approach is more evident than ever now, especially in this age of Western governments' complicity and full-fledged support for this genocide. We're seeing civil society organizations around the world have been challenging these governments from within their legal systems. At Al-Haq, we have taken legal action in a number of states, including in the US. We have a case together with Defense for Children Palestine and several individuals where we are being represented by the Center for Constitutional Rights in the US. And this is a case against Biden, Blinken, and Austin for their complicity in genocide and for their failure to prevent this genocide. It's important to note that the obligations under the Genocide Convention are not only to prosecute genocide when it occurs, it's not to wait for genocide to happen and then prosecute those perpetrators. There is a duty to prevent. And this is a duty that is not only enshrined in international law, but also in US domestic law that adopted the Genocide Convention within its domestic law. The case is that the appeal stage, and we're hoping for a good outcome. We're hoping that the judges will do the right thing. This is also an interesting case because I think it's a test for the American democracy, so to say, because we've always learned this is a system of checks and balances, and somehow now we're faced with a situation where the judiciary have to answer whether it can tell the executive branch what to do or not. This goes back to US law and the so-called political doctrine, where it's understood that the judiciary cannot tell the executive branch to decide on a matter of foreign policy. But what we're arguing here, this is not about foreign policy choices. Genocide should never be the foreign policy choice. We're talking about the legal obligations of the United States government, represented by the president, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense. We also have several other cases in relation to arms experts, including in the UK, in Australia, Denmark, Canada, where the government, by the way, announced its intention to stop such arms experts based on a parliamentary advice, which is usually not binding, but they chose to implement it nonetheless. This was after we started a case in Canada. Al-Haq also supports other cases, including in Norway, Netherlands, and many other states. But in particular, in the Netherlands, a case was taken by our partners, the Rights Forum, Pax for Peace, and Oxfam, and Amnesty International, where they challenged the Dutch government responsibility and its duty to stop exporting F-35 fighter jets parts to Israel, the Dutch court ruled that the Dutch government must stop exporting these parts to Israel because of the risk of violations of international humanitarian law. The Dutch government, shamefully, to be honest, asked to appeal this decision, and this is still in appeal stage. So these efforts, while I'm explaining all of these efforts, I think it's important to know that these are efforts that are coming from the people of the world through civil society organizations. This is, I think, what we're living now. It's a moment that is very similar to the last phase of apartheid South Africa, where the people of the world were united, took things in their hand, took the streets, where it was also evident the gap between what people wanted and what their governments did, especially in the West. It's important to note that Western governments were the latecomers when it comes to denouncing apartheid South Africa. As a matter of fact, until this very moment, most Western governments are not party to the apartheid convention and refuse to ratify it. So I think we're living a similar moment, and I hope that we will see the end of this racist apartheid regime very soon. And here, I think, let me commend the important efforts of students around the world, including in the US, who are, in my view, who are teaching us all a lesson on how this should be done, how we as citizens of the world can challenge these decisions. They are truly, I think, filling the moral vacuum created by this age complicit and morally corrupt politicians. And I think they're also providing us all of the much needed glimmer of hope of a future that is hopefully better than our bleak reality. Maybe I conclude with that on Al-Haq's work, for just to give you an idea of how difficult the situation is at the moment. Since Al-Haq's establishment in 1979, at the beginning of this genocide, it was the first time that we had to announce publicly that we are unable to cover the situation on the ground properly. Our own staff were displaced, they lost family members, I did lose family members myself, and it became almost impossible to do our work. But luckily, Palestinians have for decades had an excellent level of cooperation among civil society organizations across the occupied Palestinian territory, and we still manage to document what we can. But this is to give you an idea of how difficult the situation is. Of course, the difficulty always persisted because of Israeli repression of Palestinian human rights organizations. And actually, lately it was revealed its policies towards the ICC itself, the surveillance and the thuggish styled threats, whether from Israeli officials or shamefully also from US senates, sending the infamous letter threatening the ICC in such a thuggish manner. Maybe I stop here, and if there is more time, I'll talk more about the Israeli efforts to delegitimize Palestinian human rights organizations. Thank you.
Thanks, Ahmed. Yeah, actually, I want to give you an opportunity to expand on that. You know, we saw, as you noted, the news recently of Israeli efforts to intimidate the ICC in a very overt way, but also, you know, news of surveillance of the ICC prosecutor himself, his office, his team, which you know, might explain why the Israelis began their campaign against the arrest warrants, you know, months before they were announced. What you know, what can you share with us about what you know about what sort of intimidation, repression efforts have been directed by Israel against the ICC itself? And also against those who are sharing information with and reporting to the ICC, like human rights organizations, like the one you work for as a part of Palestinian civil society, targeted by Israel. And you know, lastly, what laws exist against this? What, if anything, are countries doing about this effort to intimidate those who are working towards and documenting, for the sake of justice.
No, absolutely. To start with, threats against Palestinian civil society are anything but new in the Palestine context. Israel even established a few years ago a whole ministry with a mandate to target Palestinian human rights organizations, and the BDS campaign. It was called the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. It even issued reports. One of them, I think, was entitled "Terrorists in Suits." Surprise, surprise. Israel also considers human rights work as terrorism. For Israel, anything Palestinians do is terrorism. And Israel also used spyware, like Pegasus spyware, on human rights organizations staff, including Al-Haq staff, in the past. As a matter of fact, in 2016, the ICC itself published the report on the primary examination, which is available publicly, where the court itself said publicly that staff of Al-Haq and Al-Mizan have been intimidated because of their work with the ICC, including in the Netherlands. So our staff, including in the Netherlands, have been threatened, which was also investigated back then by the government. But the most outrageous thing I think Israel did in the past years was the so-called designations, which was an attempt to criminalize the work of human rights organizations, which was in 19 October 2021. The Israeli Defense Minister, then Gantz, issued a decision in which he designated 6 Palestinian human rights organizations, including Al-Haq, as terrorist organizations under the so-called Israel's counterterrorism law of 2016. Notably, according to this law, any member of those organizations, so any employee of any of my colleagues in Ramallah, can face up to 25 years in prison for being, quote unquote, affiliated with a terrorist organization. Back then, actually, we objected this decision, and then they actually issued a military order in the West Bank to give this decision effect in the occupied territories, because the Minister of Defense of Israel has no authority in the occupied Palestinian territories. And this also shows you how Israel deals with law. It gives this image to the war that it has a functioning legal system, but it uses every bit of it to justify its settler-colonial project and its apartheid regime imposed on the Palestinian people as a whole. So then after we said, well, you have no authority, you can't actually designate organizations that are registered under Palestinian law in the occupied Palestinian territory, they issued a military order and enforcing them in the occupied Palestinian territory. Notably, Israel prepared a so-called secret dossier, as Israel always does against Palestinians. So we never saw the evidence of accusing us until it was actually revealed in an investigation by several outlets. I think was the Intercept and Plus 972 magazine, where they got hold of that secret dossier, and they saw that it didn't include any evidence. As a matter of fact, European officials have also confirmed that there was no evidence. There was an EU investigation that said these allegations were unfounded. To our surprise, there was actually a CIA investigation that was leaked and reported in the news that the US also found no grounds for such designations. But the Western government's passiveness once again prevailed. So basically, the US and other governments said, we don't agree with those designations, but go ahead, do what you want. They did nothing whatsoever to compel Israel to reverse these designations. There was also a statement issued by some states saying, we haven't seen anything to change our relationship with Palestinian organizations, but had would any evidence emerge, we'll review this. So basically telling Israel, please, can you get us something we can rely on, which is quite shameful. And it didn't stop there, and I'll try to be brief. And on few months after, on 18th August 2022, Israeli occupation forces raided the offices of these organizations, including Al-Haq, confiscated property, tampered with evidence, and they sealed shut the doors of these organizations. At Al-Haq, when my colleagues in Ramallah arrived to our offices, the people had already taken off the ceiling of the door, so we found our office open. So we continued our work. In our view, it is the will of the people that decided to open our office. The Palestinian people decided from themselves to open it, and we continued our work. Our general director, Shawal Jabrin, also received threats from Israeli secret services and was asked to go to them. And his answer, which we also made public as Al-Haq, and I invite people also to review Al-Haq's publication on the matter, where we provided a complete narrative of what happened. And then Shawal Jabrin told them that I'm a resident of Ramallah. If you want to arrest me, you know the way. So it's again, it's a long history of oppression of Palestinian organizations. And in our view, this was in particular because of two lines of our work. One, our accountability work and our long-lasting constructive engagement with the ICC. And the importance of this, I think that one of the only or the few sources for information of what's going on in Palestine are Palestinian human rights organizations, because Israel denies visa for Special Rapporteurs, Commission of Inquiries, or UN investigative bodies. So it doesn't allow any investigative mechanism to access the territory. This has rendered Palestinian civil society as the one of the few, if not the only, source of information for accountability mechanisms. And the second line of our work, that is business and human rights, which resulted in a database being adopted by the Human Rights Council, listing all companies involved in the Israeli illegal settlements enterprise. This is in relation to Palestinian civil society. In relation to the ICC, briefly, there was an investigation by The Guardian, and I think also the Plus 972 magazine, where they, in two parts, where they showed that Israel has threatened the former prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, including going to her house, sending her envelopes with the money and an Israeli number. It was even shocking that it was revealed that Yossi Cohen, who was the director of Mossad back then, with the help of the president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Joseph Kabila, ambushed Fatou Bensouda into a meeting because she refused to meet with him. So she was supposed to meet with the president of the DRC, and then Yossi Cohen just entered the room, and this was the meeting. And it's really crazy just to imagine how the U.S. can say with a straight face it has shared values with Israel, or Israel is a democracy, while it's acting as a gang. Also, the current prosecutor, it was revealed that he also received threats against him and against his family. There were also reports of surveillance and spyware being used against the ICC. And I think this was of particular importance because the Netherlands, as the host state, has an obligation to protect the court, its staff, and those cooperating with it. And it was only yesterday, it was reported that the Dutch authorities have summoned the Israeli ambassador to the Netherlands to ask him about this matter. So just to conclude, I think the Israelis have thought that the prevailing climate of impunity will just continue with the protection of the US. And I think now we're just seeing the true face of Israel. And if I may just say, this is the isolation is not necessarily about Israel as a state. The isolation that we're witnessing today is just what Zionism deserves. This is what the world has decided back in 1975, when the United Nations General Assembly decided that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination, using these exact words. This resolution was only revoked in 1991 after Israel reconditioned its revocation on coming to Madrid Conference for Peace, which later resulted in the secret channel and the Oslo agreement. So obviously it was just a maneuver to get rid of this of this label, but now we're just going back to this truth that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. It's a settler-colonial racist ideology, and it must be dismantled. Like fascism and other racist ideologies, it must have no place in our world.
Ahmed, I want to ask you one last thing about the designations that you had mentioned. Can you say something about the timing of that decision and what it may have been connected to in relation to Al-Haq's work with the ICC?
Yeah, I think, as I said, the reason of these designations was our work with the ICC, and I think the timing was also related to that. It seems that Israel had intel of when the ICC will decide on the Palestine situation, whether at the preliminary examination stage, whether at announcing the investigation or conducting the investigation itself. And I think they realized that it's just a matter of time before the investigation will conclude, and where warrants of arrest will be issued. And I think they wanted to label the organizations with this label to, in a way, prepare public opinion for what is coming when the courts start working, which I expect more repression of Palestinian civil society, especially in the future, because our work is instrumental to the investigation at the ICC, and Israel will do everything it can to prevent that. It's important to note that the designations came only a few months after the ICC announced that it will start its investigation of the situation in Palestine. Same goes to the surveillance and the usage of spyware on the ICC. So the more that information is being revealed, all pieces are coming together, showing that Israel have always tried to hinder this process. Israel even tried, which is, I think, a very interesting point, even tried to spy on the court to get intel of which cases the court is thinking of taking against Israel, to create moot courts or some, form of alleged justice, just to shield those perpetrators from the ICC, because the ICC functions under the principle of complementarity. So if the national jurisdiction, national authorities prosecuted the same person for the same conduct, the court cannot investigate that crime. But I think they must have realized that it's impossible for Israel even to challenge this, because the level of Israeli brutality and Israeli crimes goes to the will necessitate that arrest warrants will be issued at the highest level. And I seriously doubt that Israel will ever prosecute anyone at the highest level, let alone even someone lower level. And I conclude with this idea: people must understand that the Israeli apartheid regime is premised on a promise of impunity to its soldiers. That's why they can't afford any form of accountability, because once someone is held accountable, there will be crack in this regime, and those who commit crimes will think twice before doing so. So there is absolutely a deterrence effect to these processes, and that's the importance of it, of course, in addition to justice that must be provided to victims.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. And before we turn it over to Tahani, I just want to quickly remind our audience that you can submit your questions for the panelists through the Q&A feature on the Zoom or via email to events@arabcenterdc.org. And now, Tahani, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So with regards to Palestinian reactions around much of what has been already discussed, obviously that shift in international public opinion, the sorts of kind of action that we have seen grassroots and even amongst states themselves has been more than welcomed. However, I don't think Palestinians post 7th of October especially have really deluded themselves into being overly optimistic about how far the international institutions can really help move things or change things in any tangible way, at least in the immediate term. If anything, I think what we have been shown is that, as Susan mentioned, you have in many of these institutions, it is the powerful that dictate how enforceable a lot of these decisions are. And it's precisely what we've seen, right? It's power politics at its core, in its complete raw form, where international institutions, international law is only as powerful as international, the most powerful states in the international system allow them to be. And so far, it really hasn't done much in order to prevent this onslaught. If anything, we're now potentially facing another war on the Lebanese front, right? So that just goes to show how far institutions like the ICJ can actually be a deterrent, especially when it comes to escalation. So I think in that sense, the Palestinian reaction has been one of cautious optimism. But when it comes to fitting into, or when it comes to speaking, of a broader Palestinian strategy and where all these initiatives really fit in, again, I think that's an overstatement to assume that Palestinians actually do have some kind of coherent political strategy. If anything, I think it's the absence of that kind of political strategy that has led us to the predicament we're in today. A lot of that had much to do with Hamas's own rationale for the 7th of October. A movement like Hamas to feel pushed into a corner, to have to take drastic action the way that it did, really goes to show how low the Palestinian, strategy has kind of been driven in terms of their own internal divisions, in terms of their absolute lack of any kind of progress, really, you can speak when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, and how far Palestinian reality in the occupied territories has deteriorated. And I think a lot of that, the indicators were very much there prior to the 7th of October, when younger Palestinians were being pushed towards armed resistance, where many of them felt like you did not have a good faith partner in Israel, where many of them felt that a lot of the international community were not fair and impartial brokers, and where, to be quite frank, for a long time, international attention had completely shifted. And it was almost as though the Palestinians had been completely left to the complete discretion of the occupation, right? The military occupation, which, especially since 2021, has been, I think it's been some of the most violent years we've seen since the Second Intifada, and where Israel has been able to quite literally kill Palestinians with complete impunity, to the extent where you actually had states like the US and the European and different European states actually facilitate that in many ways. And they still are. Today we're seeing, not just in terms of the onslaught in Gaza, but even what's happening in the West Bank, where you have a population of 3.2 million who have been subject to collective punishment for events that they've played absolutely no part in. And worse yet, you have a PA leadership that has been largely complicit in clamping down on any kind of resistance or initiatives that are trying to push back. Now, in terms of how different Palestinian stakeholders or factions have reacted to a lot of these initiatives, and whether this has sort of created a bit of a watershed moment within Palestinian politics, I think, given the state of Palestinian politics prior to the 7th of October, the fact that Palestinians haven't been able to overcome their divisions, those divisions have actually become far more intractable since the 7th of October. And I think you can really classify, the debates within Palestinian politics into two strands. The first is reformists who are now thinking that resistance, whether it's civic or armed, is really the route to change here. Or you have the anti-reformist camp, which is being led by the PA, Mahmoud Abbas, his 2 lieutenants, and the PA security forces, who are absolutely adamant on maintaining the status quo, on maintaining collaboration and cooperation with the Israeli occupation. You have had, a few initiatives come out of many of the established factions, including Hamas, who has actively worked to engage a lot of these factions in terms of pushing for a united Palestinian leadership that can try and capitalize and try and lead in some of the momentum for political change that's been going on. But again, that hasn't been very successful when you have Mahmoud Abbas, who's been completely reluctant to allow for any of that or any of these initiatives to really take any sort of route. And what's worse is that, again, as Israel, he is being backed by the US and other Western allies of Israel. That really is the kind of linchpin of his power right now, the entities that are maintaining his political survival. And even regional mediators will tell you that right now, more than ever, Palestinians need a united front. They need a united leadership. But the primary obstacle to that is Mahmoud Abbas. And so, you've had Palestinian factions, and even, this has even come out from Fatah itself, its reformist current that has said that without any kind of, legitimate unified leadership, it is going to be impossible for the Palestinians to really lead the momentum of change that is going on globally. What we have seen is the PA bandwagon on some of these initiatives, again, for more self-interested reasons to ensure their own survival. And to save face in front of their own population. Again, against the backdrop of the worst legitimacy crisis I think the PA has ever experienced since its inception. But other than that, you really haven't seen much coming from within, I guess, Palestinian circles. And it's quite a tragedy when Palestinians will tell you that if anyone is expecting change or any shift in the Israel-Palestine conflict and anything positive to come for Palestinians, that's going to have to come from outside. Palestinians simply do not have the capacity right now to never mind lead on any of this momentum, but to seriously be able to affect change through this momentum, simply because they are so hemmed in by numerous red lines that the international community have enforced upon them. Even when it comes to decisions around their own leadership, that isn't not something that they can independently determine on their own, simply because the way they're thinking about leadership renewal and a united front is completely inconsistent and is a complete non-starter for Israel and its international backers. So again, it brings them back to the predicament that they found themselves in, or they find themselves in. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Tahani. I just have some follow-up questions for you before we move to our audience Q&A. We saw a number of decisions by European states recently to recognize the state of Palestine. This has been part of an effort that the PA has sort of worked towards for many years to try to advance bilateral relations with many different countries as part of sort of an internationalization strategy. Europe has always been sort of the hardest place to make progress in that regard. But we saw recognition from Norway and Spain, and also Ireland, and I believe Slovenia shortly thereafter joined as well. These, of course, are, not just European countries, American NATO allies, and important states in Europe. And in the case of Norway and Spain, of course, countries that had their own sort of roles to play in the peace process at different points in time. What were the sort of PA reactions to this? And what do you think these kind of decisions say about where Europe is in terms of its relationship with Palestinians and with its patience towards the United States and the way that they are hoping to advance their vision of conflict resolution in between Israel and Palestine?
Well, like as I mentioned earlier, the PA has bandwagoned really on those decisions or those statements, and for self-interested reasons. Again, the PA is undergoing the worst legitimacy crisis in its history. It's been seen as not only complacent but also complicit in the current onslaught in Gaza, and generally its position on resistance in the face of what has become increasingly violent occupation. So I think with that regards, it's to be expected that the PA would very much sort of support and welcome these decisions. But again, I throw a lot of caution as to why they have done that. But I think also it's just worth mentioning, yes, in some ways, symbolically, it is a good thing that, Palestinian statehood is gaining the recognition that it should. But at the same time, I'd be really cautious about what the contours of that actually mean. What does that actually mean in practice? Are we talking about Palestinian statehood within the confines of what, many have already been talking about it within the confines of Oslo, which is not self-determination, but autonomy? When we talk about Palestinian self-determination, are they talking about a sovereign Palestinian state in the truest sense, where Palestinians will have control over their own land, air, sea space, and natural resources? Will Palestinians be able to factor in their own security, or are we going to have this rhetoric of a demilitarized Palestinian state where Israel will continue to have the discretion to go in and conduct what it calls hot pursuit, right, which is to conduct targeted assassinations and arrests whenever it feels like it without any serious justification? So what kind of state are they really supporting? What is that rhetoric really, what is the underlying contours of statehood when they deploy that kind of rhetoric? Are we talking about going back to the same kind of peace process that proved to be a complete failure of the last 3.5 decades? So I think, in that sense, we do have to throw caution. As I said, it is symbolically, it is a good win for Palestinians, but at the same time, I would be very cautious because even the international community, I don't think has acted in good faith towards the Palestinians for the last 3.5 years. Oslo was not a good faith agreement. That wasn't even a peace process. When you have one side dictating the terms of an agreement onto another, that is not a peace process. That is capitulation. And that's precisely what Hamas now are refusing to do. And when they talk about a peace process, they want to see a peace process at the end of this. They do not want to see the same kind of peace process that lured Fatah into a process of capitulation. That simply doesn't exist in their vocabulary. And I think in that sense, again, the international community, I hope, are not willfully taking the wrong lessons from the 7th of October, because that will not wash down with Palestinians. That will not end the cycle of violence. If anything, it will continue to perpetuate it, because Palestinians are no longer, especially younger generations, are no longer falling for the rhetoric that the international community continuously throws at them in order to try and quell any kind of resistance to the status quo. I think that was something that the international community should have learned prior to the 7th of October, when they were trying to peddle this idea of offering Palestinians half-hearted concessions, economic concessions, in place of their political rights. And that Palestinians were very clear about that. They were not willing to undergo what they called economic sedation in exchange for their political rights.
Thank you for that. And I just want to ask you one other follow-up question. One of the arguments we often hear made, particularly here in the United States, is that the isolation that Israel is facing is only going to deepen over time, especially if it does not resolve its occupation and come to some sort of agreement with Palestinians, and that the key to this is a Palestinian partner like the Palestinian Authority, so that the Palestinian Authority is sort of seen as a partner in the rehabilitation of Israel's international image. I wonder if you could take some time to just respond to this and explain your thoughts on it and what it seems to miss.
Well, I mean, look, I take issue with this idea that Israel is isolated. I mean, it may be considered a rogue state and it's undergoing a PR crisis right now, but it is not isolated when you still have the most powerful states in the international system providing unconditional support to Israel, even regional states. I mean, states that have claimed to have cut to some degree economic and diplomatic ties. I mean, you still have, just on some level, some economic movement between the two. So I wouldn't say Israel is necessarily isolated, but it's certainly, its image has been completely dismantled, I think. And the entire facade of the Israeli narrative around its security and has been completely, I would say, dismantled. Now, with regards to reinstating, a PA within Gaza, I mean, look, the PA itself sees a role for itself in Gaza. That's exactly what it's been preparing for now. The question is, what kind of role? Does it want to does it want to reinstate itself through its institutions, or do you reinstate a security strongman who's answerable to one man in Ramallah, Mahmoud Abbas, as you had pre-2007, which is what led to the rise of Hamas and its takeover of Gaza, right? It was the mismanagement by people like Mohammed Dahlan. Those are the sorts of plans that are being floated, but Israel has already made that clear that that is completely out of the question. Now, I also wouldn't necessarily take the Israeli narrative that it has no post-war plan for Gaza at face value, because there are certain nuances and realities that you're seeing being created on the ground at the moment, right? Where today, I think Israel has something like, in terms of its actual ground presence, something like 32% of the Strip, where, you know, you can see that Israel is not going to allow anything more than actual dysfunctional governance in Gaza, where you may have basic service provision being administered by aid organizations, families, civil society committees, whatever. But they're not going to allow for any kind of entity that can ever be in a position to threaten its security the way, or its sense of security the way that it did on the 7th of October. And that position, unfortunately, just hasn't shifted. If anything, I think Israel is standing very strong in that regard. The only ones that are really peddling this idea of reinstating a PA in post-war Gaza is the US. But again, there's always a difference between what different stakeholders actually want and what reality will allow. And I think the contours of governance will really be determined at that point, once we actually do see things kind of come to a calm. But for now, that seems very unlikely, I think.
Thank you for that, Tahani. We'll start taking some questions from the audience in this Q&A session. And as more of those questions come in, I wanted to direct one to Susan on this question of sort of EU recognition. A number of states now, as we noted, have recently recognized Palestine. I think Tahani raises important questions about what exactly that means. And I wanted to ask you about sort of what the legal implications of that are in the bilateral relationships that those states have with Israel, which is obviously occupying the Palestinian state that they've just recognized. So what, in what ways do those relationships, should they change? Can they change legally? What are the obligations on those states now that they have made the decision to recognize a state of Palestine?
Yes, so I think Tahani began this, the response to this, which is that what really matters is the individual steps that these states recognizing Palestine take vis-a-vis Israel. What are they willing to do diplomatically to cut off diplomatic relations with Israel, to place visa sanctions on particular Israeli principles, or have visa restrictions across the board where Israelis are not free to enter their territory without particular scrutiny for their connections with Israel's genocide. So there are a huge range of measures that these states can now take based on this very important step of recognizing in Palestine. And that remains to be unfolded. I think, you know, a lot of this is going to come back to civil society pressure. What are these mobilized students and mobilized organizations in each of these countries going to demand? I was just in Spain a few weeks ago, and of course the conversation is completely different there than it is in the United States, but I participated in a demonstration where the demonstrators were at the municipality building in Murcia demanding immediate sanctions on Israel, and saying that recognition is not enough. So that movement has definitely started all over Spain. The other conversation that's happening there is for academic institutions to cut off all academic relations, not to allow Israeli academics to come to Spanish institutions, academic institutions. So that pressure is building, and I think will continue to build. But again, it's going to depend on how much courage these states now have to take these particular next steps, bilateral steps vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine.
Thank you for that, Susan. Ahmed, I want to direct this question to you. It's a sort of a modified question from what we have in the Q&A. You noted, having family in Gaza, having lost family there, and for so many people who are watching what is happening on the ground in Gaza and watching the international legal process play out at the incredibly slow speed that it is playing out. It's sort of maddening to wait for the international legal system to go through its various machinations over months, perhaps years, when the situation on the ground is so dire, so extreme. What else can be done if these legal options are limited, and the extent and the speed with which they can actually address a situation that's not happening years from now, but is happening now every day, and in horrific ways?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Legal processes are always lengthy and take time, and this is particularly true in international law proceedings. But international law, as it has been said, is worth what states make of it and how states implement it. International law doesn't have an enforcement mechanism. We have three preliminary provision measures rulings from the ICJ. Israel acted in a very disgraceful manner, ignoring these rulings, even acting against of these rulings. So the first one, for example, after which they, after every Persian measures order, Israel almost, after each of them, committed several massacres. So it shows complete disregard to international law. But the question is how to enforce these rulings, and the answer is the Security Council. And the Security Council, you have the American veto. So the system is not perfect, but the system can work. The problem is you have a superpower that claims to be a beacon of democracy of the world, that is supporting the genocide that is taking place, that is continue to provide arms and weapons to an apartheid regime that completely disregarded international humanitarian law. It made a mockery of the rules, the law of war, and even went further, I think, to even forge official documents. We saw the State Department issuing reports, and then experts from the State Department resigning and saying that's not what we said. The reports have been falsified. So it's really crazy what the U.S. is doing. The U.S. is complicit in these crimes. The Biden administration, including Biden himself, Blinken and Austin, they have blood of Palestinian children on their hand, and they're guilty of the same crimes Israel is committing. But if I can say from a Palestinian perspective, I don't think any Palestinian was ever under the illusion that international law can achieve liberation. It's actually not intended to do so. The system doesn't allow for it to do so. International law can only provide what it can if there is a political project that can, in a way, use international law or try to utilize these decisions politically to achieve something. So I think it would be also unreasonable to expect from international law things that it cannot provide. Unfortunately, in the situation in Palestine, it is clear that the political sphere is really bad. Palestinian leadership, I think, can do much more in this situation. Palestinian unity is a Palestinian demand for over a decade now. And the big question is also how states are reacting to this. So one of the things that we hear all the time, that Israel, quote unquote, is the only democracy in the Middle East. I don't know if anyone can say this in straight face anymore, but the US and US officials, including those I met in Congress and in the Senate when I was in DC, seem to have a serious problem, because their idea of what the Palestinians want and of the Palestinians as a whole is only what Israel is telling them. The Americans only hear about the Palestinians through the Israeli colonial lens, dehumanizing the Palestinians. So we always hear a racist, orientalist narrative that, those Arabs are irrational, they don't miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, we can't reach a compromise with, etc. And Israel markets itself to the world as a functioning democracy with a respected legal system. And this is all a facade that is just being instrumentalized to advance a colonial project, continuing to steal land, continuing to build colonial settlements in Palestinian occupied territory, and continue to deny the Palestinians any form of democratic process. So the Palestinians have called for elections for years now. Even the Palestinian PA president issued a decree to have elections, and then Israel prevented the Palestinians from having elections in East Jerusalem. And it's really interesting that some people I talk to don't even know that. So they would be like, yeah, we want to see elections in Gaza or in Palestine in general. We want to see a democratic process. Well, why don't you pressure your quote unquote only democracy in the Middle East and your closest ally in the region to allow democracy to take place, to allow the Palestinians to have elections in East Jerusalem? And the way Israel is acting, I think it's so flagrant, the disregard to international law. And the question now is not whether you agree with the Palestinians, whether you sympathize or have solidarity with the Palestinians or support the Palestinian cause. The question now truly is whether you believe in international law or not. And it's quite sad to see the US, which claimed for decades that it believed in this system and the so-called rules-based order, that is completely disregarding it now. Like, just imagine how the US can go to any other country in the region and talk to them about their human rights violations. The double standards, the hypocrisy is just shameful, to be honest. So the situation, I think, is not only the lack of international law's ability to achieve something. I think it's a combination of many other things, including political will internationally, but also the political life in Palestine, and that is something that is connected to the occupation. And Israel is doing everything in its power to prevent the Palestinians from ever being able to have any democratic process, and that is the essence of Israel's apartheid regime. As Al-Haq provided legal analysis that employs a tactic of strategic fragmentation of the Palestinians into different categories and applies different laws, oppress them in many different ways, so they can never meet, group, or form any form of resistance and objection to this colonial project. Again, now it's very clear that we live in a reality similar to that of South Africa. Israel and its allies are isolated, are a minority. Perhaps Israel is not isolated yet as as the apartheid regime in South Africa was, and that is solely because of the support of the United States. This must be made clear. If the United States decides today that the war stops, Israel would stop, and the US did it before. Israel can do that, but the US can do that, but there seemed to be no intention. And something also on the current administration, it's quite really ridiculous, the line of policy that they're following. The Biden administration obviously and clearly think if they achieved another quote-unquote normalization deal, that this will be their legacy. So there is no intention whatsoever in this administration to provide any solution or to provide any political prospect for a solution. And like it's becoming really difficult not to think, perhaps because the US was really, let's say, pissed that its project wouldn't continue within the current circumstances after what happened on the 7th of October, that it wanted Israel to unleash hell on the Palestinians. Perhaps Israel and the US wanted to make an example of the Palestinians in Gaza. And that's not necessarily what I think, but that is a sentiment in Palestine. People are not only blaming Israel for being murdered. Our children are being torn apart by American weapons. Israel is getting away with murder because of American veto. So it is American weapons, American arms, but also American diplomatic coverage that is providing Israel that ensures Israel's impunity. And I conclude with that, what the US is doing with such outrageous foreign policy is actually radicalizing both Israelis and Palestinians. What do you expect from a society that you give all the weapons they need and make sure that they're never held accountable? Of course, they're going to elect more extreme governments. So now we have a government with racist, fascist, and homophobes in the government proudly. So who decide things about the everyday life of the Palestinians. This is a result of U.S. policy, and when Palestinians don't see any prospect of peace, it is also because of U.S. policy. So, in fact, the U.S. policy is not beneficial neither to Israelis or the Palestinians. And I think that's something I also learned from my conversations in Washington. It's very obvious. We are at the moment like nothing we've seen before in the US, where foreign policy is being determined by a few people, 3 to 4 people only. And a lot of people within the administration don't like that and don't get a saying. And we saw those who resigned and announced their resignations. There are more who didn't announce, and there are more who are planning to resign. So I think this is also damaging the US's reputation and credibility as an honest broker or a state that claims to have the leadership of the world. Leadership comes with responsibility, and that entails applying the law to your foes and your friends alike. Double standards and hypocrisy should have no place in international relations or international law.
Thank you for that, Ahmed. Tahani, I wanted to ask you, we saw obviously South Africa take the lead with the case at the International Court of Justice. We saw Nicaragua with the case against Germany as well. A very clear sort of acts of leadership from the global South on this issue. Which I don't think is surprising in any way. Where are the Arab states? What have their positions been in terms of using international accountability mechanisms? How does that vary across different states? And where is this issue on sort of the bilateral agenda between the Palestinian Authority and the Arab states with which they engage?
Thanks, Yousef. That's a really great question, considering I'm in Jordan. So thank you for that. So look, I think Arab states, I mean, that's where are the Arab states? That's an excellent question. Arab states have been unfortunately abysmal in their reaction to the 7th of October onslaught. And if anything, not only are they playing a delicate PR game at home in terms of trying to balance public sentiment with their foreign policies that just simply don't gel with what public sentiment is now. They've also been very complicit in terms of clamping down on any potential movements, like popular movements, demonstrations, criticisms, of their foreign policies and their relationships with Israel. I mean, here in Jordan, you've had you have had demonstrations, but again, the numbers have been quite poor for what you would expect. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, there are numerous ways that the Jordanian regime is able to suppress popular mobilization, and they've done a very good job at that, to the extent where even now, a lot of protesters are very reluctant to talk to foreign journalists. They're very reluctant to really speak on anything that could potentially be considered controversial. When you are at these demonstrations, they are very careful to make sure that a lot of their chants, a lot of their rhetoric is geared towards Israel and its US ally rather than the Jordanian regime. They're very careful not to criticize any domestic policy. And what was worse was we actually saw a lot of these Arab regimes like Egypt, Jordan, and Gulf states, and those that actually had normalization deals with Israel at the start of this onslaught, block any attempt by the Arab League to pass a resolution that would have seen the severing of diplomatic, security, and economic ties with Israel. And if anything, they have managed to continue, those relationships since. And what's worse is you have countries like Jordan that are even abetting the aggression in Gaza right now, and have somehow managed to now get themselves involved in wider regional, confrontations. We saw Jordan providing, it's not like it actually has much of a choice here, given the memorandums it has signed with the US that basically gives the US free rein to use Jordan's air, land, and sea space to do as it pleases militarily in exchange for, the billions of dollars that it gives Jordan in aid. And again, we saw Jordan's intervention during the Iran-Israel scuffle, where they allowed Israel and the Americans to use their airspace to shoot down drones and missiles over populated areas, by the way. They've been very good at clamping down on any potential reporting, suppressing any kind of media coverage. Egypt, the same thing. When it comes to humanitarian aid, which again, has been, in terms of the sticking plasters that the international community have been trying to apply in getting around the fact that they're not doing enough to put concerted pressure on Israel to open land crossings to ensure sufficient amounts of aid are going through. Instead, they're engaging in these sort of public posturing practices of, medical convoys and airdrops and providing aid through the sea, which have ultimately killed Palestinians in the process, right? The very benefactors of this aid, as well as not actually being nowhere near sufficient. So a lot of it has just been public posturing, really, to try and quell what they think is public sentiment and outrage at what is going on. That hasn't been missed, but unfortunately, these states are very good when they have a very sophisticated, I'd say, machinery of suppression here. And what's worse is that these states, they're no more than, ultimately US satellite states. These states are heavily dependent on Western aid. So just as, Palestinians are very much hemlined into strategies that they can adopt around, the growing momentum in favor of their cause, the same thing with Arab states. They're very much hemlined around these red lines that their Western patrons have put.
Thank you for that, Tahani. Susan, people around the world, I think, are looking at the situation on the ground in Gaza. They see blatant violations of international law, no accountability. They see international organizations making statements day after day about how desperate the situation is, how it's unlike anything they've ever seen before. They see a United Nations Security Council, which is effectively, stalemated on this issue. And, they wonder if this international legal system functions. And so much of it is a product, like the state of Israel, of the immediate aftermath of the World War II period. Is it time for a reconsidering of this system? Is there going to be momentum, you think, internationally in the aftermath of this moment to try to create perhaps new international mechanisms for justice and accountability, given the failures of the ones that currently exist? And what might that look like?
Yes, I mean, that is the question of the hour. There's no doubt that the dysfunction in terms of the separation of powers between the Security Council and General Assembly, that there's huge pressure for change. And that actually has been going on within the UN system for some time. There's been a demand for an expanded Security Council. The BRICS countries have led that effort. The most populated countries on the earth are demanding a seat at the Security Council table. Back in 1950, this amazing resolution was passed called Uniting for Peace, which tried to adjust the balance between the Security Council and General Assembly. And it's actually, and what Uniting for Peace says is that when there is an impasse at a time of threats to peace and security, when there's an impasse at the Security Council, the General Assembly can take that issue and pass resolutions on that issue, basically taking the decision-making from the Security Council. And that process is what we've actually been seeing in these ceasefire resolutions at the General Assembly. Now, in 1956, the General Assembly passed a resolution that authorized peacekeeping forces in Gaza. And this was after the Suez crisis, and those peacekeeping forces remained in Gaza until Israel left the Gaza Strip. So the General Assembly under Uniting for Peace actually has more powers than we have been seeing it utilize at this point in time. And I'm at a bit of a loss about why that has not moved forward. And I've reached out to the Palestine delegation and haven't gotten a satisfactory answer. But countries like Malaysia have actually said that they are ready to send peacekeeping forces to Gaza. And we have other states that have made similar statements. So there is movement, but whether it's a lack of political courage or a lack of a sense that there will be sufficient support for this, I can't really tell you why these additional avenues are not being pursued. However, I do think that this is a watershed moment for the entire structure under the UN Charter. And I think there is going to be tremendous pressure, additional pressure on the already existing momentum for massive change in the way the UN Charter distributes power. Now, having said that, I think what this moment is also going to, is showing us is that civil society movements are going to be using the authorizations that are coming from the international tribunals and courts as a platform for pressuring their own states and their own court systems, their own judiciary and executives to take the steps that the international tribunals are saying need to be taken. So I think there's now a new kind of momentum, both from civil society to see that law is a tool. It's only a tool, but it's a powerful tool. And that the onus is now on civil society to translate that tool into action. So yes, on both fronts, in terms of the whole structure of the system and also how law is going to play out domestically. I think there's momentum, I think there's movement, but it's up to us ordinary folks who are working on this to ensure that this moves forward.
Thank you very much, Susan. And just a final question for Ahmed, if you can, very, very briefly, as we're about to close. What are the next steps for the ICC? We have the applications for arrest warrants that have been issued. Do you expect decisions approving these applications to come? When do you expect that to come? And then what will European states do if the Israeli Prime Minister or the Defense Minister arrive as indicted war criminals?
Oh yeah, no, thanks for this question. When the arrest warrants will be, well, as the procedure of the thermostat says, in due course. I think they will be issued. They will be approved. It shouldn't be difficult. Even the legal threshold is low at this stage. Reasonable grounds to believe, and usually such arrest warrants are issued. But it's also interesting how the prosecutor announced the application for arrest warrants before being issued by the chamber. That is unusual practice. Usually, they're only announced after the judges approve them. In the situation in Ukraine, for example, there were 3 sets of arrest warrants that were issued. Were only announced after the court issued them. But there could be several reasons for that. Maybe the prosecutor facing pressure because of the delayed arrest warrants and wanted to put it out there to show people that things are moving, or it could be that he wanted to shift pressure to the judges, political pressure from other states, especially that this particular practice is actually against what the manual of the pretrial chamber itself says. It advises against making anything public before the judges approve them. So I think they will be approved. And what I think that there will be more arrest warrants. Legally speaking, there have to be more arrest warrants. And I think we can only judge the current arrest warrants when we see what is coming, for which crimes and for which perpetrators. Then we can decide on that, because history did not start on October 7th, and Israel is committing crimes in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, including settlements, especially settlements that transfer population into the occupied territories. Whether European countries will implement the arrest warrants or not, I think some states have already made it clear that they would. Of all places, interestingly, Germany signaled that they might implement the arrest warrants. Norway have made it clear that they will implement them if any of those accused landed in these countries. And it was reported actually a few days ago that the Israeli government is even considering a scenario of what if Netanyahu heading to the US next month the plane will have an emergency landing in one of these states. So the very fact that the Israeli government is considering that, they also know that some European countries will enforce them. Again, this is not about Israel. Israel cannot get away of everything. European countries have invested so much in the International Criminal Court, and it's such an important institution for the world as a whole. And I don't think we can afford to lose it, because if an Israeli accused for which an arrest warrant has been issued will land in any of these countries who are under the obligation to cooperate with the court, and they will not arrest him, I think it will be the end of the International Criminal Court and perhaps of the whole so-called rules-based order.
Well, thank you very much for that answer, Ahmed. And on that note, we will conclude our panel for today. I want to thank very much all of you for joining us today, both our panelists and our audience, and for engaging with our speakers. Thank you for being so generous with your time and your insights, and apologies to anyone whose questions we did not get to answer in time. Please continue to follow the Arab Center's work at arabcenterdc.org. Thank you all again.